Hey, y'all. Kelly,
Hello.
thank you for sending a question in ahead of time.
Absolutely, you're welcome.
That was exciting to get today. I was like, oh, yay, someone's
E-
interested.
Even more fun, I was meeting with that client earlier today, and I'm like, I'm going to this great AMA, and I want to figure out the right question to ask that gets the spirit of what we're both wondering about. And we like workshopped it together.
Oh, that's awesome.
So on behalf of said client.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Cool.
All right, so welcome.
So yeah, so Sarah, welcome. I was waiting till you got your audio connected. Just a reminder. Oops, we'll let this person in a minute. Reminder. So connecting to audio. And then we'll just have to be like, you figure it out. So just a reminder, we are recording, which you have had to consent to, and also that we're going to be posting this on YouTube. So if you don't want your face on screen, like that, take that off. If you don't want your name on screen, let us know and we'll try to figure something out. We don't know what the answer
Or
there
you
is.
can rename it so that it's not
Yeah.
there, but we
Yeah.
can't sort of really cut from here. Yep.
So hi everybody, it's nice to see you. We have a nice little intimate group tonight. I don't think many of you usually come on the evening one, do you? Have you guys regulars to the 7 o'clock? Yeah.
I've watched almost all of them on recording because life has just been that way. So I'm like excited to actually be here in person.
Here you
I'm
are.
a real girl watching the recordings. I'm glad like putting that out there is helpful.
Absolutely.
There you go. M figured it out. So you can just change your name and it changes on your box too. Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so really this is going to be as casual as, we'll take any questions that you have. And I've got a question that I want to ask Tracy because we haven't talked about it very much too, that I might throw in there if there's so much time. So Kelly, you're the only person who sent in a question. Do you want to kick us off with the question? And
Yeah, and let me see if I can remember how I phrased it.
I have it in front of me if you want it read by someone else, but we'd love even more explanation, especially since there was workshopping.
Yeah, sure. So I have a client that I am working with right now who has not been diagnosed with any kind of neurodiversity and yet suspects that he might have some flavors of autism potentially or being on the spectrum. And when I've asked him about it, about, what makes you believe that that might be true and or how do you think about getting a diagnosis? He has, or, exploring a diagnosis. He shared that he feels hesitation toward doing it. Like he feels like there's a risk toward it. And so we were talking about what are the benefits and what are the risks of having an explicit diagnosis for something like autism or ADHD. And how would you advise clients who are considering whether or not to get a diagnosis, especially the risks? I think he can I sold him pretty hard on what I thought some of the benefits could be in better understanding oneself from a biological perspective, but
I'm curious,
both sides.
because of course we're coaches, so the first thing I have is questions more than answers.
Sure.
So, but I'm curious, he brought it up as like he's worried about the risks. What risks is he worried about?
So he had articulated one was a moral obligation to disclose it. Like once he knows this information about himself and he knows that he behaves in a certain way because of that, he would feel almost like he implied sort of lying by omission by not sharing the information. Especially he works in HR. And so he feels like he's held a little bit to a higher standard on self-disclosing around things like diversity or that. Second was just having anything in a medical record anywhere. What could some of the challenges be of having that written down? And then the third one, I think, is he had talked about, if he were to disclose what judgments might people jump to based on stigma or stereotype, but we both talked about how he doesn't have to share a diagnosis without offering more detail, nor would he. Really, it would be like we talked about saying, I tend to work better in this or that situation, and he wouldn't really need to give it a label in any way, shape, or form.
What were the benefits you sold him on?
In my opinion, and this was just speaking from my lived experience more than speaking as a coach, I have found that the better I understand my brain and how my brain is similar to other people's brains or different from other people's brains versus what versus what's just me or my character or my personality, that understanding where I'm similar to others based on that has been helpful. And then also I described it as having kind of like being a useful like search query prefix, where I feel like if I'm struggling with something and I go, hey, how do people with ADHD deal with blah, 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 versus how do people deal with blah, 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 I often get pretty different specific guidance that's really useful for me. So it's almost like training Chat GPT.
Yeah.
I've
Like,
been on it.
that last piece I think is really, really powerful because you can do that anytime.
That's what I was.
Right.
I mean, and I have people that I talk to about what are the things that you recognize and how can you use that research to serve you with or without the diagnosis, because it can give some different ways of trying things, some different ways of thinking about things, and some ways of sort of going, oh, the advice that works for everybody actually doesn't work for everybody. It just is generalizing patterns that the person who's writing is saying. And so
100%.
that's really useful. So I actually did a quick little sort of think through the particular cons that I've seen recently. The particular cons that I've seen recently are it is an immigration hassle and it is an exclusionary condition in certain countries from an immigration perspective.
Huh.
So that's a big deal. It is an exclusionary condition for the US military. I suspect that they're not the only military. I remember a friend of mine, when their son was diagnosed, that was her biggest worry, because she came from a military family, and that was like her biggest heartbreak, was that her son was not going to be able to follow in his father's and grandfather's footsteps. So there are things that it is exclusionary from. I'm hearing quite a lot of stories right now about people disclosing autism in particular and being treated as intellectually disabled. And so that's a social thing to worry about. One of the things that I see happening in my clients is actually turning the diagnostic criteria into limiting beliefs about what's possible for themselves.
That was actually something else he brought up as well.
I have seen that in play. I've seen, I can't change this because it's how I'm wired. Like the complete disregard that neuroplasticity is a thing and that there might be more flexibility than there. Conversation in the chat, it can have an impact on anything that's got medical exclusionary criteria, health insurance, disability insurance, life insurance, those sorts of things. And the other one that I would play with is if they're reasonably confident that this is a useful category for doing research, for trying to understand patterns, and they don't have an access to accommodations need, because that's the biggest pro, is access to accommodations. If they don't have an access to accommodations need that they need the diagnosis for, and they feel this sense of moral obligation to disclose, and they can think of places where they don't want to disclose, to me, that's an exclusionary reason. Like, that's a reason to just not get a diagnosis, to not put yourself in the position to say, like, I have my suspicions, but I don't have any data. Like nobody who can officially say yes has said so, gives you a gray area to play in that might actually be important.
Yeah, that's a very, very helpful argument is a strong word, but yeah, that point really lands.
That, this is my opinion, this is not coaching, right? But like the way I've always thought of it is, actually, it's the way my mother used to talk about testing. She was a gifted coordinator in a school district. And should I get my kid tested? Well, what is the reason for the testing? Like, what will change? as a result of testing or diagnosis or whatever. So to my mind, like for me, it makes sense to have an ADHD diagnosis because then I have meds that help, right? What I do isn't going to change whether I have an official diagnosis or not on the autism. You know, so I have a
Right.
couple autistic therapist friends who watched me for a while and they're like, yeah, probably. And the scales say, yeah, probably. I'm like, that's fine, you know, but going and getting a diagnosis, like it wouldn't change anything that I'm doing, right? I'm still, it's my brain, regardless of what category we figured out to put it in. It's like
Mhm.
nothing's changing about it. So
Mhm.
when I work with my clients, sometimes they go down this rabbit hole of like, well, which thing is it? Is it me? Is it my ADHD? Is it my autism? And I'm like, I don't think you can decide that. Like they're enmeshed, right? Like
Right.
this is all the layer that creates your brain. So like trying to parse out one thing versus another, like they are all you. And so to me, it's more interesting to talk about like, okay, where are you? Where do you want to be? What's in the way? Boom. Patterns around neurodivergences can be helpful in that. And I think for some people, the identity part of it and being like you were talking about, like knowing there are other people who are in that space can be really helpful. You know, like Kate keeps saying, you don't need a diagnosis to take advantage of those benefits.
Right.
Right.
I think there's
There are a lot of communities in the autistic space that are like, self-diagnosis is a-okay. If you think you're part of the club, you're part of the club.
if you vote yourself in, yeah.
Right. Like, one of the things that is, well, I see it more in the ADHD community than I do in the autism community. But I see it in the autism community as well, is that like, it is the process to go through the hoops to get the accommodations that we need demand us to not be who we are in order to access the systems.
Yeah.
So Kelly, what's coming up for you as you like heard all of our input downloaded to you?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've helped me see some of the inherent risks that he was describing in sort of like a really grounded way, which I think is useful. And especially like if there's no real benefit because you don't need an accommodation and otherwise you can self-diagnose, then why bother? And so I think then this is an area where he's half client, half friend. So I have to be sort of careful where I'm playing in that spectrum.
Yeah.
But I'll just own for myself, although I feel a little uncomfortable saying this, knowing it's going to be recorded and out there. So I might think about how I want to phrase this for a second. Not about him, but about me.
Yep.
I have this, so I am not qualified to diagnose autism. As far as I know, I don't have lived experience with it, although I don't know. I don't have any sort of official anything. And yet I just have this spidey sense. And as I know him and like love him deeply as a human, I will admit I have my own bias that like when I can better understand something systemically, I'm able to work with it differently. And so I feel like I am projecting my preferences onto him and I'll own that I know that if I can, that's my way my brain works. And so I'm trying to separate out, not trying to make him do things my way, obviously, not my job on any dimension, friend or coach. And having this sense that like with a little bit of scraping, a little more information could be transformative for him. And I curse a lot, but it doesn't matter to me whether or not he gets diagnosed. I get zero out of it. But I feel a desire to evoke curiosity in him about it, which I will own again is my own shit.
Right. But in the coaching relationship, like that's an absolutely, like that curiosity about how your brain works is absolutely a place where that invitation to play, what do you know about yourself? What is the self-awareness? What do you know? What are the criteria? That's absolutely in the coaching space. And for some people, getting the official diagnosis is necessary to start having the compassion for themselves.
Mm,
Right.
But that's what Em said in the
In the chat, right? So
yeah.
like, and so for some people, that's a really for some people, that's a pro that outweighs a lot of cons.
I mean, that's been my experience.
I have thrown into the chat a Venn diagram from Katie Higgins-Lee that overlaps the characteristics of autism, ADHD, and giftedness.
Yeah.
And what I love about this diagram is that it actually brings out the quality of cognitive processing, all of those things that are the long phrases of small words. They're all descriptions of sensory and cognitive processing. And those pieces are so valuable. And they're more valuable if it's not an accommodations piece, those specific things are more valuable. In a coaching relationship for sure, but also in terms of self-awareness and figuring out who am I under the hood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead.
sorry, an area where I think, as you're saying that, and he is, I would argue, he is very, very likely gifted, just based on everything that I know about him. So this really resonates. What I find interesting is because he is not only in HR, but has progressed farther in his career, he is in a world now where how he does the work with others is increasingly really important, balanced with sort of the quality of the work that he does. And that's an area where I feel like some of the tendencies that seem to be associated with autism may make his default behavior be different than many of the peers that he works with or the people he works with. And that's an area where I will admit, again, my bias to wish for him the willingness to sort of explore that space, not to ask him to not be himself, but just to better understand himself and his tendencies and other people's tendencies and look for sort of overlaps.
yeah. The there are all sorts of things about building multiculturally inclusive teams that it might be really useful for him professionally to think of, because one of the things that makes neurodivergent inclusiveness much, much more possible
Mm-hmm.
in workspaces is to actually have the team working agreements explicitly discussed and to have them be about things like, these are the behaviors that you'll see from me when I'm having a rough day, and here's how you can help. When we have conflict, these are the things that we can do. Like, this is the thing that you can do to help de-escalate me, and this is the thing that you can help to de-escalate me. To actually get that level of explicit, it's one of the places where, like, the long-standing agile teams have actually done that detail of work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those ones that when an agile transformation fails, it's often because they said, well, our team norms are that we respect each other, but we actually haven't had a conversation about what does respect mean to you, and how do I know that you respect me, and what are your assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
what that looks like. So that might be another resource to sort of have in your back pocket.
Yeah, I know that I've done that in past jobs as like a user manual. Also, is just like, here are ways I tend to behave. And none of that needs a label or a diagnosis or anything, but just like,
Right.
just so you know, my humor can maybe seem more dry, or, people tell me sometimes I come across as a robot, or whatever language would work, where it's not about anything except that I have self-awareness that I behave in a way that other people misinterpret. And so I want to put it out there in advance so that you don't create a narrative around my behavior that isn't accurate for me and my lived reality.
Yeah. And the reason that I sort of push towards team norms is because I've seen those user manuals be used in very, very exclusionary ways and in very, very domineering ways. Whereas if they're a start for a conversation, if you have a user manual and you have a user manual and I have a user manual, and then we come together and then go, okay, so here's who we are. What does this tell us about how this group of people should be trying to work? That's a very different conversation than coming in and being like, oh, so welcome to the team. Here's everybody's user manual. Figure out how to fit in.
Yeah, I get that. Thank you.
Does anybody else? I mean, this is it's not just ask us anything, but this is a conversation. So does anybody want to add or ask any questions, if that's okay, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't all jump to the microphone at once.
Well, I was going to say, there's a group called Umbrella US that just announced that they have a quiz that they have built to assess how well your business is, how neuro inclusive your business is being, that I haven't even had chance. I was trying to find it. They announced it today. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. So I can't recommend it, except that I like the people that I've met who are working on it. So
Cool.
I'm curious about that one.
Thank you.
What's going through your head about it right now, Kelly?
I feel like, I mean, I'll send him this link later, so he'll get to see all of our conversation, which will be great. But I feel like this has given me a lot of good information. And if anything, I think the area that I would shift to with him is, how do you want to explore? I think what you said up front, Tracy, about, where are you now, where do you want to be, what's getting in the way? That's an area that we've touched on before, but I've noticed there's a little bit of like, well, this is how I am, or, well, that's really uncomfortable for me, or just sort of general resistance. And I think
Mhm.
that's fine. Like, that's what coaching is for. So, diagnosis be damned. I don't need a label to be able to say, I sense a goal, I sense resistance. What do you want to do with that in a,
Yeah.
compassionate, professional way?
Love that.
The thing that I would offer there is, as a parallel, because this is really as a parallel, is when I'm working with a client who has PTSD or anxiety, because I've had quite a lot of those. We quite often have a conversation about, like, where are the edges that you don't want to go? Where are the edges
Mhm.
that you know about yourself that, like, we keep out of this conversation in order for you to be able to move forward? And then we treat those things and that just sort of, that's just who I am piece.
Mhm.
We treat those as part of the given circumstances, just like we treat, I have to be at work at 9 o'clock on Monday morning as part of the given circumstances. And so sometimes we play that way and
Mhm.
say, "Okay, like, let's not go there. We're going to accept that that exists and you have to work around it." Um, and quite often doing other things and building trust and doing other things and having wins changes their relationship to that stuff over there. Not always, but often
Mhm.
enough that I, wink when I say it.
Right.
Right. Like that I always have some curiosity about whether we're going to come back to those edges. But
Mhm.
um
It's funny, that reminds me of a meme that I saw going around in the last week or so, and it was a woman talking about her husband with ADHD, and she will ask him sometimes to help with tasks, and for him some of that will also show up as sort of what is it, demand avoidance. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's like, don't ask me to do this task because then I definitely won't do it. And so now that the way that she has managed things is, if there's a task she really hopes he will do, she'll ask him to do a task that is physically next door to it. And
I've
so,
already seen this one.
right, it's like, so he won't do the task, but then he'll be like, side quest, and he'll do the one she actually hoped he would do, and he'll feel so giddy. And I mean, it's highly manipulative. Obviously, no one would ever recommend that, but it gave me a good chuckle. It would be a good way for my husband to manipulate me.
I was just thinking, I think my nephew, like, it wouldn't be a terrible thing to do every once in a while. I just
It
put in
can't,
the link to the most updated version of that Venn diagram.
yeah, does not work for my kid is like, isn't that what we're talking about here? That, like, what works for one person works for one person.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's true for our clients too, is that this is so personal and it's so, like, let's get in there and play and let's see and let's find out where the wiggle room is and find out where the absence of wiggle room is. And always in service of what's important to them. What are they afraid of? What are they dreaming of? Yeah.
I love
I
that.
would
Thank you.
appreciate your self-awareness, Kelly, of your like, I like things to go in systems. I like them to go in these places and then I can work with them better, but also like knowing and keeping that out of overlaying that for him, making him work within that system. So that
Thank
kind of stuff is, that's the hard work of being a coach, right?
you. Yeah, it's
It's hard work.
for me, one of the hardest parts is from like a via character strengths perspective. I love learning and I love sharing and I love humor. So like my best day would be giving a presentation, which is not coaching. And so I
Right.
have to be very careful that I don't start giving presentations in my coaching sessions. But at least I know it.
Yeah.
First up, awareness, right? To anything.
That was actually one of the other questions I had is, are you guys going to start up a supervision cohort at some point?
We've just gotten another question about the mentoring side of things. So, I mean, maybe we'll put out a little poll and see what the interest level is now versus when we tried this last year. We'd love to. Both of us love helping that way. So, yes, Sarah. Oh, you came off mute and then you were greenlit. So I was like, ooh.
Oh, I think I was breathing. I mean, I feel like I want to jump in. I'm just, I don't have any specific questions.
Okay.
I found the conversation about diagnosis really interesting because I have been debating if I wanted to get diagnosed. And now I'm like, no, why would I, why should I go do that? I mean, if I am finding the information that's out there that it resonates and it's helpful, then yes, I appreciate the viewpoint that you guys provided.
And it doesn't mean it's the right thing for everybody, which is what, it's just each of our viewpoint, right?
I mean, the amount of weight that people give to the various pros and cons is so different, and so much of it has to do with how much other people have said over the years, you're weird, you're wrong, you're broken. Right. And who you've had in your corner to be like, yeah, but you're my kind of weird. Right. Like I don't remember when it was but the kids were quite little when I looked around and I was like, we would have been having this conversation because I've got 2 diagnosed kids. And I was like, I don't know from normal kids. I've got everybody's gifted. I don't know, like, have I seen a normal child in my life? I don't know. And that was so like refreshing for them. And they were all identified gifted at that time. So I was able to just be like, you're all gifted. A couple of you got other diagnoses. Like, do I know normal kids? No. So please don't ask me. Yeah. Yeah.
My mom remembers something similar from when we were little. Like, when I was 4 and my preschool was like, the teacher would be like, she's very special. My mom's like, oh, thank you. Like, just thinking of being nice. And they're like, no. So we need to do some other things, and ended up skipping the grade. And she was like, but she had no experience with kids other than me yet. So she didn't know that I was anything different from the norm. And my sister and I have talked about how we have no concept of what like average child development looks like. No idea. Milestones, whatnot. Mm-hmm.
No, I had that conversation with one of my friends who, when one of hers was young, she's like, I'm just gonna have to accept, she's just gonna be kind of an average kid. I was like, your sample size is so skewed. She's like, well, and she's pointing out several other kids who are like super achievers in the group, and I was like, that's not normal.
Mm-hmm.
You're not looking at normal.
The kids in my house range from highly gifted borderline ADHD to profoundly gifted autistic and everywhere in between. And they like rank themselves and they think like I'm the stupid one. And it's like they're in like,
well, they're also teenagers and early 20s. Of course, they think you're the stupid one. Like that's how that goes.
No. But like they would take it, they would internalize that they were the stupid one at like 5 or 6 years old because they hadn't caught up to like, the one that was great in math, and there's the one who's great in English, and then there's the one who's really good in both but not great in either, who's the stupid one. Right? Like they have no perspective. We have no perspective.
And all of the questions when you're getting your kid diagnosed are, do they do this more than average for kids there? I don't know. Like every
Such a
kid
silly
I know
question,
does
right?
that.
What do I need to put on the answer? What do I need to tick off to get the help my kid needs?
Well, and that was the other thing that I was going to throw into the discussion about making a decision about trying to get a diagnosis is, do you have a provider that you're going to trust the answer that they give?
Yeah.
And I ran into that with my oldest when they wanted to go for an evaluation. I was like, you need to, like, we knew somebody. I was like, find out from him exactly who he recommends, because otherwise I am not going to believe it. Whichever answer they give you, I'm not going to believe it.
I mean, this is an area where I still gaslight myself, because I remember I saw one professional who was a professional psychiatrist who did not diagnose me with ADHD. And it was like, okay, I trust you. Like you know this space. I must not have it. And then I remember one day Googling leader burnout, and some listicle was like, here are all these reasons why leaders burn out. And the very last one was like, I'm loath to mention this, but sometimes it can be undiagnosed ADHD. And to this day, I wish I could find that article, because that was the article for me that was like, really? And then I went and started exploring it. But then I went to one of those places that's all ADHD all the time. And like, shockingly, if you go talk to them, they'll hand you a diagnosis. Or I'm like, I'm not looking to be handed one for free like candy. I want to actually understand myself.
Yes.
And that part's been so hard.
I want to share my experience with my kids, because I think it highlights the experience as a parent, because I had 2 children from my first marriage. My daughter was diagnosed with ADD, oppositional type, back when they were, I guess, still using that. And then my son was gifted and odd. Never got a diagnosis, but he's odd. Okay. Cute as he could be, but just an odd duck, right? Then 8 years later, I remarried. I had a child from my second marriage who is advanced but neurotypical. And I spent so much time with her. Like, I would ask her to do something and she would do it. And I remember being shocked. I'm like, whoa, what was that? You mean? And so just the realization of how traumatized I had become, having, by the experience of my first 2 children, because no, they weren't typical. That was not a typical. So I did have that comparison of a neurotypical, and I spent all my time just like kind of going, you mean I'm not going to have to pick you up and carry you to go do that? It's like, it was a crazy difference in experience.
Oh, interesting. So how do we bring these experiences or not to our coaching?
Thank you so much for what you just said, just as my sweet kid walked in. Like, the minute you were like, they would just do what I asked them to do, it was like, that's a thing that can happen? Because I do not have that experience as a parent.
It took a new husband and a third child, and I found that experience. So yes.
I'm getting it with teenagers.
Finally, oh no.
Like, I don't tell them what to do. I ask them if they would do things for me, and quite often they get done.
Yeah.
Because there's some PDA profile kind of stuff hanging out in my house, and they inherited it.
Remember, there's 5 of them in that house total. County Cape. 5.
Yeah, including me, but yeah. We're a party.
How do we bring this to our
Well, I would say that the just being curious about that individual, sort of keeping all of this as possibilities in the background, and then what's real because even if you have the diagnosis of X or Y or Z, nobody presents with everything. It's like,
Yeah.
This is really strong and I don't have that part of it. So just, what is it for you? Or how do you cope with this, the fact that you won't do something if your husband asks you to do it?
I think that's kind of why I asked it, is like, how do we bring it or not bring it to coaching? Because sometimes it's harder. Everybody wants industry experience, for instance, for this lived experience, and there's ways that that's helpful, and there's ways that that's difficult to not make assumptions based on what we know, even in this realm, you know.
I feel like something that maybe helps me personally, maybe not as a coach, but just as an individual, because I think I see some of those PDA tendencies in myself as well. Or there's this like, I'm smart, I've tried that, I thought of that, I've tried that. It's like the yes but games. But when somebody says like, take this or not, but I know a bunch of people for whom this has worked, I feel like it triggers a different level of like, maybe it's not competitiveness, but it flips a different bit that makes me want to try it more. And so that's part of the thing that I like about sort of structure, or that it's like, maybe it's like a FOMO thing. Like, yeah. So I offer that as one way that it helps me with, or why I apply it in some of my sessions, is I'll do the same sort of like, your mileage may vary. And I had a client with a really similar problem and they did this and like, it changed their life. Probably maybe won't work for you. I don't know, but I've seen this one case study where it did.
Yeah, like I definitely do that. I definitely do the, like, I've heard these bunch of stories and I've heard these people talk about how their inner experiences and how this works with, and like, does any of that feel like it might be worth trying? For a lot of the folks that I work with who really don't like to try new things, often putting 6 or 8 things out in session 1 will, and then ignoring it and then being like, they didn't pick it up, so we're going to go on. In session 3, they'll be like, so I tried this new thing. And I will be like, oh, I think I might have mentioned that. I'm going to tuck that in my back pocket as tools for me as a coach, that planting seeds sometimes works if I'm totally not attached to when they land. If it over, there's a Hasidic story about the prayer that Jewish men, Orthodox men are supposed to wear, and a thing in their heart, and that Rabbi is asked, why do we wear it on our heart? Why don't we have it like in our heart? It's like, your heart's not usually open. You want to make sure that when your heart opens, that it's there so it falls right in. And I feel like there's a bit of that with.
It also works with teenagers.
Yeah. Teenagers who have not been raised in a consent culture, who've been raised in a compliance culture, all of the things that we talk about as normal teenage behavior are those defiant, non-compliant things that often neurodivergent kids have done as toddlers. And so by the time they get to teenagers, if you figured out a family dynamic to work it, you don't have the same, like, all of a sudden they're rebelling that more typical pattern is.
Can you say that again? If you're raised in a
consent culture, like
okay.
the thing about a PDA profile is a pervasive demand for autonomy. So
Right.
it has to be a pure consent culture. It has to be completely, unless it's a safety thing where I can physically move you out of the way, I have to influence you and make you, and like, I have to help you want what I want for you. Like, it is completely influence based. If you've got a kid who presents with that at 4, 5, 6 years old, you have to learn how to parent very, very different in those early years. By the time you've parented that way and they get to teenagers, they've got really good collaboration skills, and you can partner with them and like co-lead the family with them. And it's really awesome. Ask me how I know, because this is like my delight. But the typical way of doing things is that the little one does what they're told. And then at some point, usually when they're teenagers and they're like, I have got to learn how to live on my own because I am about to be thrown out of the nest because I live in, and that there's the like, who am I and how am I going to be tussle. And if as a parent that is like, okay, I'm going to let them grow, then they develop into their own. And if it's like a control piece, then you get the ultimate midlife crisis, which is like, I have just spent the last 50 years working the job my dad wanted for himself.
I just put a link in, like, Kate literally wrote a book on this. Some parenting tips for neurodivergent kids. It doesn't say it's for neurodivergent kids, but based on
I
how
just-
Thank you for anticipating why I was about to come off mute, because like this is my 4-year-old to a T. Like every night is a battle over pajamas, and it is breaking my heart. And I could use a lot of help for her to work through this.
It's coaching your kids means letting them make a lot of mistakes, and means making peace with the fact that they learn a lot of lessons the hard way, because compliant kids, we can keep them out of trouble more easily until they can actually have some of those logic circuits in to actually reason their way around some of the problems. If they're not compliant, if they have that, like, I will learn it my way, their way is very immature for a long time. And it's hard to witness. And this, I see this in coaching all the time. A client who's getting in their own way over and over and over and over again, and it is resistant. It can be hard to stay with them while they're trying the old way harder.
Yeah, I just hadn't heard that terminology before in that.
Culture, language. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really, it sums up where, like I have been saying, like the transition to parenting teenagers is coaching. You can't tell them what to do, and you have to let go of outcome, which is really hard.
It's terrifying. Yeah, it's really hard.
Coaching skills come in handy all over the place, don't they?
Well, it turns out I was doing a lot of it already, and then I'm learning about it as coaching. I'm like, oh, this is why this is working. Or, but yeah, I remember seeing when my kids were little a psychology video test, like where they were doing something at a university, and they had a 2-year-old that was told not to touch something, and the parent sat back and was reading, and that child never touched it. And I was like, I've never seen a kid who would not just wait for you to not look and go touch it. Like every kid I know. And I was like, wow, there really are compliant kids. That's terrifying.
Really, there's really interesting stuff about the attempt to replicate the marshmallow test.
I've read a bit about that.
That the initial assessment was that it was about executive function, and would you hold for the delayed gratification? And there've been like modifications that really reveal it's how much you trust that the adult will follow through on the promise, how much like you can subtly change the words so that the kid feels that the adult's on their team, and then they're more likely to do what they've been asked to do, rather than if they think that like there's an us them dynamic in there, they're less likely to do it. Like there's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, there was on that same one, there was another layer about scarcity. Like what level of relative wealth do they have or not have? And I don't think they actually controlled it for socioeconomic variables either, which is a whole nother aspect that made the results not replicable.
Yeah. More and more little data about like why for us as coaches to not assume that we actually know anything about where our clients are coming from, because how many of those kinds of details do we just not ever get about our clients?
Yeah. Kate, you said something before about working with a client who seems to be getting in their way consistently, or sort of struggling to walk through, as my 4-year-old then walked in. And so I missed if you covered some of this with Erin or not, but I'm curious if you have seen clients that have had that progression and then have had that sort of turning point moment, and if there's any patterns around that.
Yeah, so I had a client at one point who was trying to make it as an actor. And at one point, the coaching question that I asked was, what will you need to have done in order to be able to walk away with no regrets? And they laid out like all of the stuff. And it was like, beat myself against the wall in these following ways. And if I can do that and nothing lands, then I can walk away. And after that conversation, like that was one of those ones where I was in the moment and I could feel that like they were ready to walk away, but they weren't ready to walk away. And that question just popped out of me. But ever since that moment, I've had a variety of clients who have it in their head that the way that they've been doing it is the right way to solve the problem, but that they're just not good enough at it. And sometimes the way they make progress is we spend 6 months every week coming up with a new way to try harder. And sometimes that's what it like sometimes, and at some point, you know, usually I'm like, is this working? Is there somewhere else to be like, I'll ask this question, but if they put their foot on the gas, I'm like, all right, I will ride with you until we run into the wall. And when you hit the wall, I'll help you pick up the pieces. And then when they're ready to give up, they really give it up. They're like, oh my goodness, I have tried everything. I am ready for something totally different. And then they're like, and I'm totally lost. I don't know. And then we have this exploratory place, and it's terrifying to them, but ultimately freeing. And it's super important for me to be able to be like, okay, so now we're lost. Let's enjoy being lost for a while.
I mean, I get that. The like perpetual trying and failing is more familiar than giving up or accepting that it might never happen. Like those are actually scarier than just like, oh, it's just another day of me, you know, trying and failing at my Sisyphean whatever.
Yeah.
That's comfortable, right? Like even though it's continual failure, it's familiar, so it's comfortable.
Yeah.
So like trying to think something new is scarier, especially like really new. I test this out with my clients before, like as we're doing the trial and error thing. Every once in a while, they'll tell me something like, here's what I've been trying to do. So I should just like do that. And if we're far enough into the coaching relationship, which is only a few sessions really for me, I go, yeah, how's that going for you? Right? And they're like, huh, and not so good. I was like, okay, do you want to keep like, would you like to keep doing that, or should we explore doing something else? And it's totally okay if you want to like just tweak that and do something else, but oftentimes like just that sort of mirror of like, you sure? That helps. But my clients are often, Kate and I've talked about this, my clients are not quite as stuck as her clients seem to be. So I'm working up to her level of stuckness in my coaching range.
In the chat, this comment about learned helplessness is really, really powerful. Because that does happen. That does happen in that place of like, I've tried so hard and it's never going to happen. And that like, how's it working for you thing doesn't work if you're hitting that edge.
Yeah.
And I often have, I used to have more clients that would hit that edge harder. And at that point, it like the coaching changes like, okay, what's it like here in this place of believing that nothing is possible? And like getting really okay with, okay, so this is your realities right now. You don't believe that anything's possible. I believe that there are possibilities, and I'm going to believe until you believe. I'm going to believe on your behalf for a while. And for right now, we're just going to sit in this stuck place. And that can be incredibly powerful too. That can often sort of loosen up enough to be like, I don't have to beat myself up for being this awful. And that, what did you just do? You just said this is okay, but I came here to fix this, and you said we don't have to. Like that is a real like mind shift sometimes.
And that's where, for me, I've used diagnosis as a hack for that, where it's like, it is given me the permission to stop trying to change myself. Like my biggest example of this is I have accepted that I care so much about novelty and I have such a hard time with boring tasks. I no longer pack my children's lunches because I cannot muster the energy to do it. I have given myself permission to outsource that. But I feel like if I didn't have some way of, some language of, no, really, boredom is like physically painful for me because label, then I would feel like a self-indulgent blah, 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 blah. So in some way, it like gives me permission to make accommodations for myself and feel more at peace with it, even though I don't answer to anybody but me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think you can offer as a coach is you can offer, I don't care whether you have a diagnosis of, I think that you are perfectly fine and I'm happy being here with you and we're going to take you as you are and we're going to help you forward. And this is actually a place where I find that standing in the coaching stance and saying, if I was a therapist, I might care about how you got here, but I'm a coach. I just care that this is who you are and you want to go somewhere else. So let's take you as you are and see what we can do from here. And I find that a really powerful, like it's not the diagnostic label, but I use it in the same way.
Totally.
If you look at my website, I've said this before, so sorry if I'm repeating myself, but if you look at my practice website, it doesn't say neurodiversity or ADHD or autism or diagnosis anywhere. It says gifted, buried halfway through the FAQ. And like that, those words are in my SEO, don't get me wrong. And also what I find is the clients who come to me directly instead of through a directory or something, it's because they connected with the way that I wrote the thing. And like some of the snarky captions I put under a couple of the pictures and the picture of the ducks that I have where he has a stormtrooper hat on, you know, like, or one fellow, when I asked like, what made you choose me, that the colors on your website, which are orange, green, and purple. So like they're connecting it. We're not saying we're both ADHDers and therefore there's something underneath that, or there's a flow somewhere.
You're flagging in your own way.
Yeah. And
I
I tend to work with the extremely and profoundly gifted. And my website is like very simple at the top, but underneath there's like a block that has all the buzzwords. Like it's got polyamory and all of the queer categories and all of the neurodivergence and creative and innovator and artist. And like, it's got all of the buzzwords.
I also kind of figured that Nerd Coach was enough, but like if you want to go to a site that's called Nerd Coach, you probably are self-selecting in the first place. So there's that, that's even like the starter of it.
This question from Emma in the chat, the implicit question that's being discussed is how do we as coaches navigate our own changing identities while also working with clients? Yes, yes. And this is true for so many coaches in this space, that we're in this space because we have a personal connection to the community, whether it's us or not. Tracy, how do you navigate your changing identity while working with clients?
That's it. So most of you know Kate is
Notice how I dodged the question myself
so nicely. Very adept. So Kate is also my coach, so she has sort of like an inside track on what's going on, which is like,
I cheated. Sorry,
not sorry, really. Well, that, I mean, like, I'm just thinking this is something that we've been talking about a lot lately, is like how to show up authentically when you're not sure who you are at the moment, right? Like when you're on a growing edge, or you're like, you know, in that space of, wait, I'm reorganizing the way that I think about the world, reorganizing the way I think about myself and the way I think about my work and all those things. And I still need to show up and coach. And I don't want to do that in a masking kind of way. And like part of my reorganization is how do I show up even more authentically with clients, right? Like how do I show up vulnerable? Those pieces. And so yes, it's absolutely like, how do we navigate our identities as we are also coaching? I don't have the answer because I'm kind of trying to figure it out as I go. And I'm still in it. So I can't like tell you what's going on. Does anybody else like resonate with that?
I mean, I'm happy to actually sort of tell my story too. I'm just laughing at Em's comment in the mothballing my website in a pre-identification state. Like mothballing the website is absolutely a thing that I do when I'm going through a transition. Is it's like, you know, there it is. It is what it is. I know it's not quite right. It's not. I was just saying to somebody recently that I know it's not right for me anymore. And the who I'm becoming hasn't evolved enough for me to articulate it. So it needs, like, I know I'm going to have to do a rebrand later. What I mean by changing identities is that I mature, that I see myself differently, that I get a sense of who I am, that I think of myself differently. And actually I've become different through learning experiences. And so because the quality of my presence is what my clients are signing up for when they come. I mean, that's the biggest thing that they get from me is the quality, the skillfulness of my questions. Yes. Like the nuances of the practice that I've done. Yes. But really it's the quality of my presence. And so every time I integrate another part of my shadow or another part of my past, or I have a new experience that opens up my mind to something else, who they're hiring changes. And it is tricky. And it does mean that we see coaches rebranding over and over and over again. What I have noticed is that quite often, like early on in a coaching career, there's like a lot of rebranding. Like there's a lot of like, I'm catching up with myself. I'm catching up with myself. I'm catching up with myself. There's a lot of self-reflection in the growing as a coach process. And then there tends to be some stabilizing. But I have been saying, and I've been saying this to probably for the last 2 years, I don't know who I'm becoming. And the longer I keep saying that, the more I'm like, there's a website out there, but I don't know who it is. And the best I can do with my clients is just keep showing up as who I am, not trying to pretend that I was who I was the last session. And not, and to really commit to, okay, it is Tuesday, the 17th of September, 2024, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 people that I have, that have never been together have showed up. Yes, 2 people with these names and bodies, mostly the same, showed up a week ago, but actually it's new. The piece about specific groups is really interesting for me because until Tracy and I started working together on the academy, I didn't talk about my own identities at all. And so as we've been doing this, I've been like, which of my identities do I claim? Which of them do I put out there? Which of them do I, if you've been coming to our master classes, like at some point early on in the process, I put profoundly gifted on those slides. That is not an identity that I had claimed professionally until we started working together. But then I was like, people want to know who they're getting. People want to know, like, how do I know anything about being different?
It's like the plus you put on my highly gifted, right? Like I came to accept highly gifted while I was working on my dissertation and reading about the differences. And I was like, oh, my friends aren't good. They're like, not just that we didn't know what normal child development looked like, but like us too, right? So I kind of come to that one. And Kate and somebody else was like, give me a break. I'm like, the numbers don't show there. No. So she sort of convinced me to put the plus on there, and that's, it's still not comfortable. Not fully claiming that, but not surprisingly, I was interpreting it the same way as Kate, as development, like my identity being, how am I, like, where my vertical development, what's happening with that? You know, right now I'm in a disorienting dilemma. So sometimes in that moment, like I don't know which end is up. And also, I'm here to be your coach. But the nice thing about being a coach is you don't have to know which end is up. You just have to be curious. Right? So sometimes I do my best work in that place.
Yeah,
So-
the thing that's in the chat there that I just want to sort of narrate is that I tell the story differently depending on who I'm talking to is really, really valuable. Sometimes it's really useful to say as little as possible on something that's permanent, to actually sort of have like that website or whatever, to actually be like images and like a picture of me and a name and a like contact information, so that you have the freedom to, when you're in the different specific places, to tell the story differently, because it's absolutely true. We're so complex as human beings that there's no one story we can sum up without taking as long as we've already lived to tell the story.
And oh, sorry,
So-
Sarah.
Well, what I'm thinking about for me is like that question of how can we show up as coaches when our identity is still evolving? It just kind of didn't land for me, because and what I'm sitting here processing through is what I'm finding is I have been masking my entire life and have never felt comfortable until I got into coaching. And coaching is the only place in my life I feel I've ever shown up as my authentic self. And so for me, I was thinking that's just I just show up as authentic, and then it's less about who I am and more about being present and listening and curious, to my client. But yeah, I think the point I'm saying is that coaching is my only place that I am that it is me that's there.
I think I am me in my coaching. It's not that quite. But like I've had a couple clients lately that have challenged me in ways that like I haven't been this challenged in quite some time. And it's forcing me to grow as a human and as a coach in order to show up in a way that serves them to the best, in the best way I possibly can.
Can
So
you
that-
say more about that?
Can I? So I had a client who was very, very, very stuck, is very, very stuck still. And I was getting very frustrated. I like interrupting, with presence wasn't working. Having a conversation at the beginning wasn't working. Trying to reset during the session wasn't working. And I actually found myself, which I don't remember ever having this thought of. I actually found myself thinking she's uncoachable.
Yeah.
And as I thought it, I noticed it and went, this is what you teach. What are you doing? What do you mean she's uncoachable? Like, what kind of hypocrite are you? Give me a break. And to me that signified, well, I've hit an edge. I've hit a limit to my range. So I have the opportunity, I can either she's coachable or I can grow my range. This is an opportunity for me to develop.
Mhm.
And so I came to Kate and shamefully was like, had this thought while I was coaching this client, and like, I got to figure out something else because that's not okay. Like, I'm not okay with that, like that coming. But that's the level of frustration and dysregulation I was in, right? So I don't remember the questions there, but like, it's that my client pushed me to be better.
Yeah. No, that I asked for more information of what it looked like for your client to have challenged you. And that's, thank you. That was super enlightening.
I usually find myself giving advice when I'm being challenged and to grow in that way.
Yeah, I feel a pressure to solve the problem. I go back to that.
Yep.
Rebel, I'm curious, when you asked the question, what did you mean by Alice in Wonderland?
Yeah.
So in Alice in Wonderland, there's a quote, I don't remember it exactly, but Alice makes a statement that she's not the same person she was this morning and the afternoon and the end of the day, because she's constantly changing. And she also made a quote referencing the previous day. She's just basically referencing she's constantly in a state of change because there's always new things added to her life or new experiences. And so you can't possibly be the same person you were 2 seconds ago.
In that case, yes, absolutely, like Alice in Wonderland. Is that just Cheshire Cat on your Zoom picture?
Yep, that's my spirit animal.
He's awesome. I have a T-shirt that says, it just has the smile that says, "We're all mad here."
A friend of mine did a piece of art at Burning Man this year that was a huge tree with the Cheshire Cat up in it and poofing a bunch of fire out of it. But if you would like to see that, I'd be happy to share it with anybody. It's amazing.
Yes.
That's awesome.
It's so fascinating how the coaching relationship is like this person at this moment in time and this person in this moment in time. And it's different every single time, and it's different as it passes through the session. Yeah. People and how they work and how they work in groups and how organizations help people thrive and how groups of people help people thrive has been my passion question since I was so like this is my I'm like we can have this conversation all day long.
What else, y'all? What has that conversation sparked for you all?
Sorry, I'm just looking at the Cheshire Cat picture. That is amazing.
Okay, now we all have to go look at the Cheshire Cat picture.
Sorry, not sorry.
So I'd like to ask, somebody put in something about while also interrogated internalized ableism. I do not understand. I understand the words. I don't understand. Could someone tell me what that means?
I will give it a shot, and then Kate can supplement me, and Em can, since it was her original thought, she can supplement both of us, or just start typing. Sorry, I'm totally distracted by this now. I'm going to close it for now. Very cool. Thank you, Kelly. So we know, but we generally know what ableism is, right? Like the assumption that you do things in the way that many other people do it. The internalized ableism is the like, why can't I just file this? Why can't I just make the phone call? Why can't I just, right? It's the self-shaming is kind of how I see it. And like assuming I should be able to do this thing when actually like my brain is not set up to do it. Like Kelly outsourcing her kids' lunches, right? Accepting my brain is like, that is a thing that is always going to be hard. And that is, so I'm going to make an accommodation for myself. And that's okay. But like keeping that from you because you should be able to do the thing. And so like we're always uncovering more and more of that. Right? Like whenever your client says should, they're probably uncovering some of that. So that was not my best, most cogent response. Kate, help.
I mean, I think that the thing that I'm thinking about is that this gets so complex. Our relationship to language and norms and that sort of thing. And I think that this is where like maybe the interrogating piece is one of the things that we sometimes say is that what's easy for me is hard for other people and vice versa. And so sometimes if we're sort of gotten the like we're broken because we don't do it because we're not like the easy things are easy that are easy and the hard things are hard, and like if that's taken in a deficit model, then there's like, oh, like actually there's another way of looking at it that is like I'm really good at some things that other people aren't good at, and so I have a different set of challenges. So there's that different, not broken piece. One of the things that I find when it comes to like this recognizing, questioning, stretching piece that is there in the chat that Em's put in is it's one of the things that I sometimes see with clients who've got a diagnosis or even the coaches that I'm mentoring who've got a diagnosis is okay, so now I have to compensate for who I am. That becomes like, that's the internalized ableism piece there. And then there's this other piece that is like, I might think I'm always going to be this way because I've always been this way, and I've been this way for a long time, and I've seen myself as broken in these ways in a long time. And it turns out that actually, if you haven't ever practiced anything, you're still as bad at it as you were the first time that you tried it. And so I think that it's like, it's in that play of like, if you're going through, you're like, who am I and what am I and what is all of this stuff and what is good and what is broken and how do I show up as a coach when you're going out in the marketplace and saying, hey, come to me, I can help. Like, there's a whole complex range of development and internal interrogation that has to go in there. So that's the space I'm playing in when I read that comment.
Okay.
Flipping which things are the variables and which things are the constants. Yeah, I think there's something really powerful with that.
How's that sitting?
I think I still I get, and I was comfortable with the concept of but and then I'm trying to work that was the word interrogating that didn't kind of match with it, but then you put the description in there, which is, it's like challenging, questioning, poking at it. And so and yeah, and I'm kind of really deep in thought because this is all just shown a big light on why I'm kind of miserable right now, because I'm being forced to do a project that is, I'm not being forced, I have been given a project that is I've often said and you guys are just helping me see exactly why it is so painful for me to have to try to do this project. It's boring. It's so
Yeah. I mean, and if you take this sort of concept, which is in extremes on the edge cases,
yeah.
this is the same question that gets asked when the rest of the coaching world says, you know, what's your genius zone? Right? Like, what is the place that, I think it's the same thing. It's just more extreme when there's assumptions about that doesn't get to be your genius zone until you've done years of being like, you don't get to be a systems thinker until you've done lots of work being a like details oriented person. Is the one that I see a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can't keep track of these things, so how could you possibly like handle more? If I can handle more easily.
Yeah.
That part easy.
Give me the abstract algebra, don't make me do multiplication.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think something I feel like we're talking about the spectrum of that I think is causing good heat and discomfort for me is like, when do you accept versus when do you try to grow?
And when do you run away?
I ask that question of myself all the time. My version is like, am I letting myself off the hook or am I taking care of myself?
Right.
And
the question that I have been wrestling with a lot over the last year is, how much control am I actually giving my clients about what they do in terms of accepting or pushing or growing? Because if I ask a challenging question in a condition where they trust me and they trust the space that I've shown and they're open and vulnerable, I'm pushing openness. Right? That's taking a stand for change. And you know, is the fact that they've hired me as a coach, can I actually take that as permission to help them change? Or do I have to keep negotiating that, like moment by moment by moment? Like, that's a serious question.
I mean, we're making, in our coaching sessions, like we're making choices so much. It's amazing we don't have a decision fatigue. Like, is this an okay place to crack open a little bit more? I had a client who's doing really good, like deep work, and she was being really extra resistant to something. And I took a chance and I said, I'm really curious about how resistant your brain is being to this change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think about that? She was like you could tell it took her metacognition like up another level to be looking at it there. And she was like, oh, she was like disoriented for a minute. And then she came back together. And I wasn't sure by the end where we were. And she was like, this was great. Like her takeaway that day was, I'm so glad we're doing this. Right. So like, but it could have gone the other way too. Like, was she ready for that level of
Yeah.
deconstruction?
I had one recently where there'd been sort of like not making progress. I'm going to harder on this. And a client came in with, and I said, so what do you want to focus on? And they came in with something that was not related to what we were doing and said, like, this is up and I want to like touch on it and then get to the other thing. And I was like, okay, we can do that. They said the thing. I got curious about the thing. 55 minutes later, after having interrogated the thing that was like the new thing, I said, okay, so how does what we've done in this conversation relate to what you were working on last week? And it cracked things open. But that was a choice I made. Right? Like that was a choice I made. It was in service of the client's growth. It was in service of, we could have another session where we go down the same path, but we've done 6 of these in a row. What if we do something a little bit different and then we get there? And we're making those choices. And our clients trust us to make them wisely.
That has happened to me more than a few times. Somebody comes in with what they think is like a quickie sort of throwaway, let's just go through this. And it's not, because it turns out it's not.
Yeah. I have a client who comes back every 6 months or so and says, I need 3 sessions. And the first 2 sessions are clear enough space so that we can have the difficult conversation in the 3rd session. And they know it and I know it. Right? It's beautiful. It's very effective, but it's like, I need a chunk, and it's because we're going to put off the hard one until we've cleared all these other issues out of the table. Yeah.
So what about what we're saying resonates with y'all? Or doesn't?
Ask that again, please.
What about what we just talked about around this is resonating or not resonating for you, or what's it bringing up? If I can stack 3 questions like I just did.
I just did.
I'll do what I do.
Answer the question that resonates with you. Isn't that the one?
Pick a question, any question.
Well, first I was trying to think of whatever the clever portmanteau is for productive procrastinating. Because that's, Kate, it sounds like that's what you were describing that your client does with you with the first 2 sessions that are talking about the other stuff. And there's like some
Procrastivity.
There you go. Thank you. That was what I was thinking right before you asked about what's resonating. And then as I think about the what's resonating piece, I will acknowledge that an area that I'm still really developing with my clients is contracting. And so if they don't come in with a really tight contract, if I want to work on blah, if they come in with like, I don't know, let's kind of figure it out together. Like, it's funny, Kate, as I'm looking at your octopus, I have this like very octopus feeling of like trying to hold an octopus where it's like, what do you want? There's some days where I just want to be like, what do you want? And I should probably just say that.
When you're holding that lucid, what assumptions do you make about what they actually want?
For some, I tell myself a story, whether or not it's true, that they want me to solve the problem for them or hand them the answer. There's a very like advisory dynamic to it. Like, you did XYZ job, what would you do? Or I'm like, even if I tell you what I would do, it might be terrible advice for you. Or even if I try to give you advice on what to do, I might still give you terrible advice. Like, I am not an oracle. And I find that I struggle to get clients comfortable with understanding and being open to coaching. And that instead they tend to want much more structured support. And I don't know how I mean, all of my background is corporate. And so there are some days where I'm like, fine, I'll just make a spreadsheet with you. But I'm like, no, that's not my job. Don't make a spreadsheet.
So I'm gonna use the thing for my book, and I'm gonna offer it. I highly recommend that. This one is actually good for my book. So it's called The Coach Approach to Parenting is the subtitle, but it's actually a coach approach. It's just like the first part is like how it plays to parenting, but in there is it's a reworking of Martin Seligman's work of the 5 things that human beings need to flourish. That's the work that he did after happiness, where he's like, no, happiness isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5 things are good feelings, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of meaning, engagement, like being the agency, and positive relationships. And I hold as my assumption that every single client's agenda is actually to have a balance of those 5 things that makes them feel good about their lives. And that everything else is a proxy for those things. And so when I have that octopus moment, and I get a lot of clients who are like, I just want things to be better, and I've heard you can help. I get a lot of those. And so I do a lot of dancing in this octopus space. And when I'm trying to hold the agenda, my assumption is that underneath all of that octopus, that's their agenda. If they can't articulate it, I hold that as their agenda until, and then anything they give me, I hold as their agenda. But I always have this assumption that this collection of things, like,
Thank you for as the structured frameworky person. Thank you for that. That is something I will be very able to anchor onto. That is incredibly helpful for me.
You're so welcome. Yeah.
I realized I involuntarily made a face as you were talking, Kate, which was not like a face at what she was saying. But what I'm hearing in that is the framework I use is Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory. And they say that humans need 3 things. They need to feel competent, they need to feel autonomous, and they need to feel a sense of community.
Isn't that Dan Pink's autonomy, mastery, and purpose from Drive?
I don't know, but if it's Dan Pink's, he got it from Deci and Ryan, because they're
Yeah.
And
the
I've
guys.
seen a really interesting thing recently talking about how Daniel Pink changed it in ways that do disservice to the theory, and that going back to the original is probably more useful. So yeah, I nerd out on all this stuff.
Thank you.
Self-determination theory was part of my dissertation. So yeah. As of 2017, I had read everything there was to read about.
I love it.
I want to do some verbal processing to hear what I think is a totally valid agenda. Yeah, the other one that I get sometimes is, I just need someone to witness my experience, and you're the one I trust to do that. I'm like, that is a totally valid agenda too.
I sometimes say, like, if a client doesn't know where to go, I'll say, well, how about if we just muck around a bit and see what happens? And that ends up sometimes being like super powerful session, because whatever it is that comes up, it's really what needs to come up.
So do you take these approaches from a neurodivergent or gifted informed perspective? Because I find like traditional coaching programs, and I'm like sort of a fresh grad, seem to discourage verbal processing in general, or just sort of mucking about. But as a client, I love doing that. Like, my best sessions are sometimes when I can just like roam free across the field, and I need like 2 or 3 questions, and it's not meant as a disservice to anybody. It's just, that's how good stuff happens for me. And so many trainers don't teach that, or even discredit that.
So I am also, I have been for the last going on 3 years, a coach trainer in an ADHD coach training program and mentor. And I have wrestled with this in terms of like what my experience is versus what I'm bringing to my students. What I've come to is there's sort of like, there's different phases of your coachhood, right? So when you're just learning how to coach, the framework is really helpful. And ask these questions to start with, make sure you ask these questions to end with. The other thing that it does, we are also honestly helping people learn how to pass their ACC or PCC exam. right? If you need to tick these boxes. I wouldn't send a mucking around conversation to the ICF lesson. It doesn't fit. Now, I am still serving this, I am still acting in the spirit of the competencies, which is a phrase I stole from a friend of mine, Diane McLean, who's also an ADHD coach. I'm very much acting in the spirit of the competencies and like what at its base coaching is. And that's kind of what we have tried to bring to our master classes so far, right? And that doesn't mean I'm taking my PCC markers every time I do it. Because PCC markers is starter PCC, right? Like hopefully that you evolve. And if you read like Marshall Reynolds' books, or like I heard her speak last March, she specifically says, I don't know why people ask what outcome they want at the end. And I'm like, because it's in the markers and we got to tick it off. Like, how lovely for you, you know, fourth crescent of ICF Global that you can do that. But like, I have to teach my students that to get their credential.
Yeah.
You know, I've had some other
my
students come
background
from-
is different because my background I come from a coaching school. My original coaching school had a different, didn't give scripts, didn't give the formulas, that was very much coaching from principles. And when this question was asked, so one of the skills that we were taught was to bottom line. So we were taught bottom lining and interrupting. We were taught as skills you need to be able to use in the conversation. And then when a classmate of mine asked essentially this very question, the answer that I was given was, sometimes a client needs to say something to clear it out of their system. Sometimes a client will self-coach once they start talking, which is the verbal processing. And sometimes they will talk themselves into a rut. You need to interrupt the moment they start talking themselves into the rut. Everything else is progress. So what you're listening for is the rut. And so that didn't come from the neurodivergent, that didn't come from the gifted, that just came from the training, like, just do that. Like, there are these varieties of things.
Which is also what I teach my students, because we have a lot of that concern about verbal processing. A lot of ADHDers are also verbal processors, right? So there's a lot of concern around that. And some of the trainers teach them how to interrupt, but they get concerned when they'll be like on the transcript, the monologue this long, but I'm listening and there's progress. When they start rehearsing, is kind of the way I put it. They start rehearsing the thing, or we're going into the past, right? Like we're digging into those neural loops that have already been formed and just reinforcing the stock. That's when I'm like, so that's when you, like, you know, consciously interrupt.
And that one you submit for your MCC.
Yes. Yes. Lissa DeHart and Carly Anderson had a conversation on Lissa's podcast about this, that I remember sitting in my car and listening to, and like just kept going, yes, and pointing at my stereo. Yes, that.
Yeah.
So
When we're talking about the test and the testing, the thing that is really challenging with the state of the ICF right now, and it's a reality that we have to deal with, is that they brought someone in to try and do a like solid remark, make these metrics totally observable, behavioral, like let's get the art out and make it a science kind of metric piece in it. And there are good reasons for doing that, but it means that it's normalized a easy to measure standard rather than a we can see, like, we have to intuit what's happening, and we have to read it, and we have to understand it, and the differences between our schools show up. Like it's a baseline, which means that it's grounded more in neurotypical learning patterns than it used to be. And so it's causing some accessibility issues for neurodivergent clients as clients in that space, and neurodivergent coaches who are already coming in. the thing that Erin said about like, I've already been doing this. Like, I've been doing this in my life. And then I was like, oh, I've been coaching already. A lot of us come in having already navigated a whole bunch of these skills just for dealing with the people in our lives and our own circumstances. And so a lot of us aren't coming in. A lot of us have to come in and do the like, oh, we're not broken piece. And a lot of us have to come in and go, oh, we're not giving advice piece. But a lot of us, when we make that flip, we go from we don't have a clue what coaching is to we're like mid-level PCC, like in a 50 coaching sessions, not in 500. It's not across the board, but because the lived experience is different, and the we are so practiced at dancing in places where we don't know what the rules are.
Totally true.
Yeah. So we just
I
come in
just-
with the skill set that other people need to learn.
I just threw in the chat, and I will admit I haven't finished reading this, but this article just came across my LinkedIn today. It's a year old. This is Richard Boyatzis's research about coaching competencies, and like I was partway through and it was fascinating. He's got a new book coming out next month too. It looks really interesting. But I'm interested to see how this intersects with the ICF coaching competencies and intersects with the way that we're thinking about like coaching that we come and we having conversations with you all about.
Yeah, this is where I'm so glad that you guys are doing this focus on neurodiversity, because like even just from my own lived experience, I was in a practicum last week where a presumably neurotypical coach was coaching me and was being observed by a presumably neurotypical coaching mentor or supervisor, and I was verbal processing in the session. And the advisor's feedback to the coach was that the coach should have said to me, "Hey, Kelly, are you aware that you're all over the place?" And that evoked such an enormous shame response in me that I just started crying. Period. It was just like, this, I'm just different.
I had that exact thing happen in my coach training, or almost exactly. I was being coached by, and I didn't know about neurodiversity, neurotypical at the time. This is like 2008, 2009. I knew my brain was different. I wasn't even diagnosed with ADHD yet. And I was coached by our most sort of cut and dry colleague. He was using the GROW model. As soon as they taught me the GROW model, I was like, I'm throwing that out. That doesn't make sense. So he was trying to coach me. And he tried the 1 to 10 scale, which like I don't connect with those at all because there's no reference. It doesn't mean. And the like what everybody else was saying afterwards, the feedback was, yeah, he did a really good job considering she was all over the place. And it's that phrase. And that phrase is still like an activator for me. And I didn't even notice it until one of the other coaches in the group said, I didn't experience her as all over the place. And I don't think that's what was going on. I heard her processing ideas, making some conceptual jumps, blah, blah. And I started like just lost it.
Thank
Just
you for
lost it.
sharing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm unfortunate.
This is where I get really grateful about the training that I did, because whenever we did feedback, the feedback was always like, what did you see? Not a suggestion, but what did you see? And then asking the client, what was the impact of that on you?
Exactly how we do it.
And that as a training modality, like that honors that every client is different. And that what matters is the impact in the client, not what it actually looks like on the surface.
We ask our students, the feedback that they are allowed to give is like, what core competency did you notice? And what's the example of that? It's helping them practice like learning what the competencies are. It's only giving positive feedback to the person, the critique to the mentors. Yeah.
Yeah, I would hate for anybody to sort of reverse engineer the various places I have trained, I wouldn't say this experience was emblematic or symbolic of my whole experience. It was this one particular mentor in this one particular moment. And it was just surprising to me that like this was a person in authority, and that really stung. So hearing you guys describe how atypical that is also really just helpful and validating, because otherwise it was students and one, grown up, so to speak, in the room. There, it was a bunch of other students looking at one another.
Yeah, I've definitely had things that are related to my neurodiversity come up in coach training and be told that the way I see things is wrong. So it happens.
Yep.
Yeah. And yeah, so we just keep working on trying to notice it and be aware of it and not do it. We have taken our hour and a half and run over.
We hope to see you again soon. Oh, our next one is Monday, October 28th at 11:30 Eastern. It's in the newsletter that we just sent out. It had the Zoom link to come to this one. And the Zoom link, I believe, is going to be the same.
I think so,
we'll
but
send out stuff like
check the newsletter. We'll send out confirmation. Yeah.
And meanwhile, like, feel free to drop us a note. We miss y'all.
All righty. Good night.